In equilibrium, profits are zero, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about a normal rate of profit, but that's equal to the rate of interest. So you get a situation where it looks like, capitalists can't make a profit. And Schumpeter explains this very, very well. He says profit actually comes out of innovation by capitalists, and they make profit in the phase between one productive system and another, where their innovation causes the change. Marx said, no, it's actually profitable to make profit even without innovation, because capitalism to function has to produce a physical surplus. The number of commodities input has to be less than the number of commodities output, and our production systems give us that capacity. So, there's always a net output, net physical output of commodities. And Marx's original explanation for that was where the labor theory of value came in. He had a much better explanation, which I talk about in my thesis, and people can find my papers on my blog on that front as well. But the basic idea is that there's a physical surplus produced, and then capitalism lets you monetize the surplus so that capitalists then make a profit even without innovation. And I have a paper that explains the mathematics of that called Explaining the Paradox, Solving the Paradox of Monetary Profits, which has just been published in an online accessible journal called the Economics E-Journal. So it isn't just arbitrage. It has to involve production and making a surplus out of production. And because capitalists control the means of production, they get the surplus, they get the profit.
Okay, well, I got to say, I'm going to have to do some more research on that to digest it all. But before we get deeper, I want to get on to something else. I just have to, I mean, as fun as economic theory is, which I love it. I could talk all day on this. I just have to ask you about your thoughts on the Australian economy. And I got to put it in this context that in America, and for the record, I am a Canadian who's been living in the U.S. for 20 years. So I still consider myself a Canuck, or should I say a citizen of the empire, or no, I suppose we call it the Commonwealth now. By the way, I met Lady Astor once, Winston Churchill's daughter, at a banquet held by the Winston Churchill Society of Vancouver for when I was doing a debate.
Definitely.
As a teenager, when I was debating, but in my old debate days. But anyway, aside from all of that, in America, I am actually somewhat astounded at how many people are negative on the American economy. And there's so many people. I mean, I think like Peter Schiff seems to almost typify them, where it seems like any country in the world is better to put your money than America. And for the record, I am not. I am by no means bullish on the American economy, and I am not an apologist for American economics policies or so on. But I find it incredible that people think they ought to be putting more money into the housing bubble of Vancouver, or putting their money into more bubbles in China. And so I'm just curious. I mean, is Australia maybe the one place where people really should be putting their they should be buying euros. That's right. Everybody should be buying lots of euros and dumping dollars. Anyway, so I'm just curious, for being somebody who's from Australia, and I hear lots of Americans say that Canada and Australia are great economies, they're resource economies, and look, they didn't get whipsawed by the financial downturn, so their financial systems are sounder and better run. So is this financial crisis just an American problem? Just because of American stupidity?
No. I think America did a better job of it than most of the rest of the world, but it's something which has been global. And like I cop a fair bit of trouble in Australia on this front, because I came out predicting the financial crisis starting in December of 2005, and I did it both on the basis of American data but also Australian data, because to me what drove the financial crisis is a debt bubble. The biggest debt bubble in human history. People have been borrowing huge amounts of money and using it to speculate predominantly on houses and also on stock markets. So this gigantic amount of borrowed money that's been taken out is what actually caused the crisis, and that happened in America and it happened in Australia as well. But the The difference with the American economy is that you had a larger level of debt you took out, and you also had a much larger shadow banking sector. So if you look at the financial sector's debt level in America, we peaked at about 120% of GDP, when if you go back to 1945, it was 2% of GDP. So a huge amount of money borrowed by the financial sector from the banks and then lent to American businesses and households to speculate on assets. That's why your crash was so much bigger than the crash in Australia and so on. But the same thing is happening in the rest of the world to a similar degree. And there are some countries like Iceland and Ireland, for example, which went even more extreme than America went. Now, the difference about Australia and Canada is that they have had, particularly Australia, had a housing bubble that started to burst in 2008, sometime after your bubble burst. We'd had falling house prices then, and the government got out of trouble by restarting the housing bubble. So it looks like a well-performing economy in Australia has two components to it, or three components. One was a much more successful fiscal policy than America played. That's because they gave the money to the public and said spend it rather than giving it to the banks and saying lend it. The former worked much better than the latter. China, because we export enormous amounts of the Australian terra firma to China, so we're benefiting both from their enormous bubble and their genuinely booming economy by selling them minerals, whereas you guys mainly suffer by losing productive capacity to them. And the final thing was this restarting the debt bubble in Australia, the private debt bubble, by encouraging people back into the housing market using what they call the first home owners scheme, where they used to give people $7,000 a deposit to go and buy their first home, the government grant, and here again is the government meddling and stuffing things up, and they doubled it to $14,000 in the middle of 2008, or late 2008, and that restarted the bubble that saw house prices rise by 20% in 2009 in Australia. And that
I heard that recently. Sorry,
yeah.
I heard that recently they've now even they're even helping more people get homes in Australia by allowing rents to be counted as deposits or as savings.
Yeah, that's the banks themselves, because whenever you have a bubble going on like this, it'll start off with banks lending, say, something like 70% of the price of a house. So you might have a house you want to buy for $100,000 and you manage to save up $30,000. You go to the bank and the bank checks your credentials very carefully and then works out, yes, you can afford to finance it at $70,000 a year, and they give it to you, and you then start off buying a house where you own 30% of the house as soon as you walk in. That was the situation back in the 1960s. Now, banks make money by creating debt, and of course, if you want to go and buy your dream house and you have $30,000 deposit and somebody else has $30,000, you both go to the bank, and the bank gives for the other guy 70% loan to valuation ratio, and you get a 71%. You get to the auction with 101,000, and you beat the bloke who only got the 70% loan to valuation ratio. So we all have initially an implicit interest in having the banks increase the amount of debt they'll give us to buy a house. Then, of course, the banks get on a roll. House prices start to rise. People have to borrow more and more money to do it. You get to the situation which applied in America in the late 2005, 2006, and still applies here today, where banks will lend up to 97% of the deposit price, the price of a house. Now, that means that back in 1960, we had a $30,000 deposit. You'd get a $70,000 loan, and the most you could pay for a house would be $100,000. Now it's precisely the same deposit, $30,000. They'll lend you $970,000, you can pay $1 million. Well, guess where the high house prices have come from? So that's the danger. Now the banks.
But if prices are rising, it doesn't matter whether the borrower can pay, because and it doesn't even matter if the bank is lending 120% of the value of the property, because it'll appreciate so much it can always be resold at a profit.
That's what got you guys into trouble, and we're doing exactly the same thing down here. And, of course, we've only managed to get out of the crisis by delaying it, so I think we're now starting to see prices turn negative here, and then, of course, you get the dilemma, oh, dear, I can't get out of the debt by selling the house for a profit, and you start seeing the whole thing unwinding again. Of course, when it unwinds, the house prices crash, but you're left with the same level of debt. So basically it's a Ponzi scheme, and we've fallen for the same Ponzi scheme. We just have to convince ourselves that it's actually not a Ponzi scheme. But I think we're getting new figures coming out in the beginning of February that should tell us that Australian house prices have finally started to fall again after the government got in there and manipulated things in the final 2008-2009 period.
So do you think that the financial crisis of 2008-2009 was a precursor, or was just a foretaste of something worse that's going to happen in the not-too-distant future?
Not so much as something worse. It was the beginning of something which won't end unless we abolish large parts of the debt. Because this money, when you think about it, this money should never have been lent in the first place. Because the real function, and this is me being partly prescriptive, and I hope you'll let me get away with this one, the real sensible role of a monetary system in capitalism is to give working capital to firms and give them money to innovate and let people who want to live in a place they own rather than rent do so by effectively swapping ownership for rent. I said those are three legitimate roles of the financial sector. When the financial sector lends money so we can all go to the casino and blow it, that's not legitimate at all. And even when that casino is then a Ponzi scheme where the borrowed money causes asset prices to rise and causes a positive feedback where more and more people come in to borrow the money to drive the asset up, that is basically borrowing money and using it for non-productive purposes. And what it gives you is more debt, but not more capacity to service the debt, and ultimately to lead to a financial crisis, which is where we are now. That's what the banks have done. In America's case, that took you from a debt level compared to your GDP of about 50% back in 1945 to 298% in 2008. And now you've gone from having half a year's debt to 3 years' debt over the period of the post-war period. And since 2008, you've gone from 300% of GDP to 270%. The whole process of deleveraging is what's giving you a crisis. Now, you won't see the end of this. You'll see periods where things get better for a short while because there's a couple of complexities as to how changing debt affects the economy. But you won't be out of this until you've got the debt levels back down by at least 100% of GDP. And to give you an idea of what that means, in the case of the Great Depression, your debt levels in 1930 began at 175% of GDP. They blew out to 235% courtesy of deflation and the collapsing GDP